so this is a project that that Una Osilia and I started a couple of years ago, so before the current crisis, but it sort of takes on additional resonance now. We'd like to understand not just sort of the direct effects of a financial crisis, but also what's happening to investor confidence, because that's going to have a lot to do with how quickly the economy recovers here and abroad. So let me tell you a little bit about what we're doing here. So bank crises are common and costly. If you look at data from 1980 to 2001, there were 113 systemic bank crises in 93 countries, and the output losses averaged about 13% of GDP. One of the costs of a crisis is going to be loss in confidence. So here's my favorite quote. Crises leave citizens wary of entrusting their savings to the official banking sector. This diversion of savings is likely one of the great and unmeasured costs of banking crises. Right, so financial intermediation is going to be much less effective if people decide to keep their money in the mattress or whatever the equivalent of that is, rather than putting it into the banking sector when people can lend against it and so on. And here's a picture from Northern Rock. So here's something from, which is a bank in the UK that went under last year sometime. And there's similar pictures you can find banks in the US where you see these, it's a bank run, right? Like IndyMac looked like this, where people are lined up to get their money out of the banking sector, even in countries which have deposit insurance. So even when there's no probably real likelihood that people are going to lose their savings, people can be really worried about losing their savings.
So are you going to say why you think that is then? So if there is deposit insurance, there is no risk of losing your money, so why?
I'm gonna talk about that a little bit. There is some difference in how people seem to react depending on whether or not there's deposit insurance. In the UK, actually, they didn't have full deposit insurance, and there was a big debate about what they were going to do. So there was some limit on deposit insurance. They ended up changing it in the midst of this run on Northern Rock, and they eventually made people whole. Even in places where there is full deposit insurance, there's sometimes a delay before you get reimbursed. And so there can be a liquidity issue even if you're eventually going to be made whole if you need those funds to meet your daily expenses and so on. So there was an article, I think, a couple of days ago about somebody who had money above the FDIC insured deposit limit in a bank in the US, and they're going to get some settlement money, but the FDIC, because they're doing so much other stuff right now, has stopped payments to them. So it's been 8 years since they've got their money. Now they're getting money that nobody really owes them in some sense because it's above the deposit insurance limit, but you can see how that's still a liquidity issue, even in countries like the US where we think these things work pretty well. Okay. So one of the issues is, how do you measure investor confidence? If I'm looking at a country that's experienced a crisis, I can't tell if savings has gone down or people are not participating in financial markets because they've lost confidence or because they just have less wealth. So I want to be able to disentangle those things. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to look at the financial decisions of immigrants in the US. So they have different histories. Depending on where they came from, they may or may not have experienced a financial crisis. Then we're going to look at their behavior here in the US, where they're in a common institutional environment, and I have data on wealth and a whole bunch of other characteristics about these immigrants, so I can try to, I'm going to argue that the effects I see here are going to be largely the impact of confidence, not the direct effects of wealth and other things that might have happened in the wake of the crisis. Yeah.
Will you get into general government structures in those countries and things that pull that out from the effect of banking crisis?
I am going to do some stuff like that. I'm going to look at how the effect of a crisis varies as a function of different country characteristics. In most of the specifications I have, I'm going to have country fixed effects to try to wipe out a bunch of stuff like that. So I'll basically be comparing immigrants from the same country, those who lived through a crisis and those who didn't. And so the country stuff, things like institutions and so on, will be wiped out. But I'll also do some stuff where I interact exposure to the crisis with characteristics of the country to see if the impact is different depending on legal structure, institutions, the level of financial or economic development, and so on, or presence of deposit insurance. So, let's see. So, immigrants are going to measure their exposure to systemic crises depending on where they came from and when they came. We've got them in a common current environment, right? So institutions are the same, access to the banking structure is more or less the same, or at least to a first approximation the same. So, but if crises have, long-lasting and important effects on confidence, then they might affect financial decisions even for immigrants in the U.S. And then we have to be worried, though, that the decision to migrate is somehow related to crisis exposure, and that that's correlated with unobservables in a way that might also impact your financial behavior. So we're going to try to address that in a whole bunch of different ways. There's nothing sort of bulletproof, but I'll sort of show you a whole bunch of different ways we've tried to address that. So here's how to think about this. So suppose you've got some demand for bank services that's a function of the return and your characteristics, and you have some belief about the probability of there being a bank crisis. So what you care about is your perceived return, the sort of objective return on bank services times 1 minus pi, the probability that there's not a crisis. So you're going to use banks if your demand is positive given your beliefs about the probability of a crisis. So how should we think about pi being determined? So imagine we start people off at time 0. You have, you can think about this as sort of a Bayesian thing. You have some probability of a bank crisis for person I from country J. Time 1, you either experience a crisis or not, and then you might update your belief. We're going to kind of think of people who actually live through this crisis, think, wow, they're more likely than I would have thought if I hadn't lived through one. And this may interact with country characteristics, individual characteristics, and we'll be able to explore some of those things. Okay. Then at time 2, we're going to observe this person in the U.S. and see whether or not they have a bank account.
So the crisis is exogenous, though. So it's not like one of these self-fulfilling expectations things.
Right, it's exogenous, right. So nothing about their beliefs is going to trigger a crisis.
Precisely not like the standard background.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's not going to be that I think there's a crisis and so that creates a crisis. Hopefully the country fixed effects take care of that possibility. You certainly would imagine that this sort of, since we're comparing people from the same country, that underlying levels of trust or things like that we would think would play into these self-fulfilling prophecies are going to get wiped out by that fixed effect. So it's going to be differences between people from the same country. So now we have to think about what outcome to measure. And the outcome we've decided to focus on is whether or not you have a checking account. And one of the reasons we want to do this is because this is basically a technology choice. This is one, and we think it's going to be less affected by unobservables like risk aversion, your wealth shock from a crisis, things like that that might influence your demand for other types of financial investments, so holding stock or something like that. So something like 90% of U.S. households have a checking account, so virtually everybody. They're relatively low cost. And this might be a conservative measure if you think investor confidence has a bigger impact on riskier investments. Of course, we're investigating banking crises here, systemic banking crises, not necessarily shocks to the broader financial system. So it is obviously a bank. The alternatives to checking accounts for people are some combination of check cashers, money orders using cash. And the cost of checking accounts are low, but they might be significant for some low-income immigrants. There may be perceived legal barriers to opening a checking account as well. But in any case, we're trying to use a measure that we think we would be more or less unaffected by unobservables. So if it is the case that, after a bank crisis, people who are more risk averse are more likely to migrate, so that our exposure is correlated with risk aversion, we don't think it would affect the choice of having a checking account that much. Or that's the hope. So that's one way we're going to try to address that issue.